George A. James here. Welcome to the Creation Darwinian Evolution presentation. It's December 11, 2020. I started this some months ago this year, and I'm glad you're joining me again through YouTube or Facebook, whatever it may be. I want to look at the theory of evolution with you, specifically from the eyes and the mind of Charles Darwin. I'm going to break some things down here in my outline of notes. I have a sketch for you. I want to try to define things and consider things, and then build from here and consider some of the interesting points of the life of Charles Darwin. So, the theory, in essence, each species is not the same as it was in the past. Each has changed over time. Now this time could be 600,000 years, it could be 1,000,000 years, it could be 10 million years. We don't know for sure. And that's usually the case. There's always things we don't know. There's three components, in essence, that being natural selection, evolution, and the origin of species. Trait mutations and modifications appear. A trait that was rare appears more frequently, becoming the norm within the species. This, in essence, is natural selection. Let's say a moth, white moths have the capacity, they have the genetic material to create a brown moth. So this can happen, and the survival quality of that moth is, if it's a brown moth, it may be better to the environment for its survival. Now, favorable mutations accumulate and adaptations occur within the environment. I want us to take note of mutations, because mutations often are not positive, but rather they are abnormal or adverse to the organism. But with Darwin's theory, it's critical that they are positive. And if we give it enough time, that's how a mutation can be positive instead of negative. Just consider. I want to whet your appetite right now. So, this is how evolution takes place. So, natural selection again, we have the trait that was rare now appearing more frequently, becoming the norm within the species, natural selection. And now the favorable mutations over time, the adaptation within the environment. This is how the evolution component comes into play. Two groups of the same animal adapt to different environments over time. How did they get to different environments? Who knows for sure? You weren't there. You weren't there. I wasn't there to observe it. So we don't know for sure. We can speculate. We can say, well, maybe early man brought various species or animals to them at various locations throughout the world, to various locations throughout the earth. Okay? They then come to constitute different species over time. Why? Natural selection helps in this process, because the species is changing, it's evolving, it's adapting to the environment, and if need be, it changes into something else. It is important to note again that when we consider this, what do we find in the fossil record? What is seen? What is observed? Part of science is observation. Part of science is transparency, evidence. What do we see? What do we actually know? Not what we think we know, not being biased towards our beliefs or ideologies, but rather what do we actually know? I want to get a little more specific with you. Natural selection. Organisms produce more offspring that are able to survive in their environment. Darwinian evolutionists would say this evolving was actually accomplished by natural selection. So I'm kind of reiterating a little bit, getting a little bit more detailed in considering the theory that Darwin proposed and expounded upon and made famous the world over. Now, when a plant or animal produces offspring, variations appear. Okay? Some of the offspring will be different from other offspring. I mentioned the white moths producing brown moths. There's a genetic capacity for the offspring to be a little different than its parents. But it's not a different species, however. It's not a different species. That's important to recognize. Some evolutionists, Darwinian evolutionists or Darwinists, declare that it is these variations, which they call natural selection, alone which have caused all life forms on our planet, zebras, goats, monkeys, horses, etc., jackals, grass, clams. It goes on and on, pine trees. So all of these items, this caused the differences, the variation. Here's a quote from a staunch believer in the Darwinian theory. Michael Roos is his name, and this is from the book Darwin Defended, 1982, page 308. I'm going to read this for you. Natural selection allows the successes, but rubs out the failures. Thus, selection creates complex order without the need for a designing mind. Without the need for a mind, a designing mind. But when we look at our homes, our apartments, our skyscrapers, a watch, a car, a motorcycle, there's a mind behind the creation, the design of it. Is it illogical or logical to assume that human life, plant, animal life, a mountainous terrain, the grass, the various animals, that there is a designing mind, a designer behind these animal designs or these environmental designs? Something to consider. Now, he goes on. All of the fancy arguments about a number of improbabilities having to be swallowed at one gulp are irrelevant. Selection makes the improbable actual. So, a staunch believer in Darwinian evolution, and he believes that Darwinian, or Charles Darwin, he settled the matter completely. And some do believe that. Interestingly, I had a professor in college, an environmental science professor, and he mentioned that Darwin was wrong. Yet he believed in evolution. But he had his own theory. Interesting, eh? So as things have gone on in time, many people have bits and pieces of Darwinism or are with Darwin altogether, and some have gone off the Darwin bandwagon altogether into something else, into their own theory and ideas. A physics professor, another little story here. I forget how we got into the conversation, but I asked him once, how did this happen? The question was pertaining to the universe and its origin. And he told me very candidly, I don't know. I wasn't there when the universe started. I wasn't there when the universe was created. So we sometimes think we have the answers, but if we don't have all evidence, if we did not observe ourselves, then how do we know? Is it our biases? Is it our own philosophy or ideology based on what we were learned, what we were taught, whether it be in a church or school or university or whatever it may have been? So, things to whet our appetite as I proceed here. A fundamental teaching, let me back up just a moment. Charles Darwin said that natural selection was the primary way that everything changed itself from lower life forms into more complex forms. So This is how Darwin said that things evolved over time. A fundamental teaching of evolution is that every living thing in our world, whether it be plant, animal, or bird, evolved from other creatures, which ultimately originated from dust, rock, and water. Very interesting. Let's go into some tidbits of information on the life and times of Charles Darwin. He was born into a very wealthy family, into a life of ease because of the wealth of his family. He did have 2 years of medical training at Edinburgh University. He didn't finish his schooling, however. He was more interested in partying and drinking with friends, going out, having a good time. Not unlike many other people, young people in their late teens and early 20s. Of course, this can also apply to people that are much older than that as well. So let's be fair and honest about that. So, under the direction or guidance of his father, he goes into theological training, interestingly, as an Anglican minister. Now, he does finish his schooling here in 1831. He completes his theological training. He's deciding, where do I go from here? Where do I take my life? A wealthy cousin or family member mentions that I can get you a job as a naturalist on this ship called the HMS Beagle. It's going to be traveling. It'll be great for you. You have a great experience. So he's not a naturalist. His scientific training is very minimal, but he becomes the naturalist on this ship. And I must say that his curiosity, his interest in his surroundings and the environment is evident. I would not say Charles Darwin was a brilliant man. I would say he's probably more intelligent than the average person, perhaps. I would not classify him or categorize him to the level of an Isaac Newton, maybe one of the most brilliant of all people. And that's my opinion. But a mental giant like Isaac Newton, Charles Darwin shouldn't be in the same classification or same category as a man like that. But Charles Darwin did express, he did demonstrate curiosity, ambition, and a creative mind, I would say, based on how he theorized and how he thought about the world around him. But many of his ideas were not new, and that's important to note too. So, he goes on the voyage as naturalist of the HMS Beagle. It is December 1831. It comes back to England in October 1836. I have an illustration of the voyage of the HMS Beagle. I'll share that with you at this time. Hopefully this will work well on camera. So, right here, as you can see, there is South America. See my thumb right there? And here, he goes around South America. This is the HMS Beagle. So it's here, and you can see it goes all the way, nearly around basically around the world, in essence. But here, at the base of South America, comes up around, and off of Ecuador here, where my thumb is the Galapagos Islands. Here he makes what he believes are some incredible discoveries that build the foundation for his theories and his Darwinian evolutionary theory. Now, he does collect rocks, various animals and plants that he brings back to England. Also, his observation of finches is very significant. Now, it was believed the finches came from South America over to the Galapagos Islands. What's interesting here is that the finches, he noticed adaptation for this species. But they remain finches. They're not something else. So this is important, because Charles Darwin, what is very critical for his theory as well, is the intermediary species. The species here becomes a new species over here. what happened between, what happened in the middle here. Supposedly, there's a fossil record for this, but it's very minimal, and some of it is very fraudulent as well. We'll get into that at a later segment. But I want us to recognize that finches are still finches. They are not something else. But they lay the foundation, as well as other observations too. But the finches themselves pretty much are the starting point, are one of the key building blocks for his Darwinian theory of evolution. Some other interesting pieces of information: when he is traveling around South America with the crew, he's invited to take part. This is before the Galapagos Islands. He's invited to take part in ceremonies. What kind of ceremonies? Witchcraft. Interesting. Eh? Witchcraft ceremonies with some of the native peoples of South America. After this, he becomes ill. He's plagued with some illness that he can't quite pinpoint. He suffers for the rest of his life. Now, he does live to a reasonably old age. He dies in his early 70s, so a reasonably long life. But he is plagued with various ailments and a weak constitution, not as healthy and as vibrant. Moving on, with Charles Darwin, he believed the finches, getting back to the finches here a moment, that they showed a cross-species of evolution, a change into new species. As I mentioned just a moment ago, they were still finches. And the reason I mention the witchcraft ceremonies, it seemed as if maybe it changed the way he thought about the world around him. I don't know that for sure, but that's why I bring up that particular point. And in my outline here, I have various segments on Charles Darwin, just a little outline explaining and sharing things. Now, moving on, this was the primary evidence of evolution he brought back to England. So it was the finches, the concept that he built from them, as well as other animals, plants, and rocks. And in the Galapagos Islands, he does spend there 5 weeks in the summer of 1835, as mentioned. I didn't mention the weeks there, but 1835 is the year. So it's the tail end, or close to the tail end of the exploration with the HMS Beagle. When he returns to England in 1836, he does go on to marry his cousin. Now, I realize, and you may very well know, that at this time, people married their cousins, but I wonder what his thought process was for that. Because of his theory, of what he was building within him, what he was theorizing, does he think that marrying his cousin is the right decision? Unfortunately for Darwin and his wife, his children suffer from this. I believe he has 7 children. 3 or 4 of them die as infants or adolescents, and they all suffer from some kind of physical or mental abnormality. So this was not a good decision from that standpoint for Charles Darwin and his wife, being his first cousin. In 1859, as things continued to evolve and build with his theory and his ideas, he completes a book, a famous book, as you may very well know the title, On the Origin of the Species. Notice very carefully the full title: By Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Did you notice that whole title? I have a copy of the 150-year anniversary of his book, the 1859 Origin of Species book. It doesn't mention the original title, but the original title, On the Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. There seems to be an underlying concept here as we look at the entire title and take note of that. So consider that. Here's historian Farrington. Here's what he had written. And this is, once again, just considering and looking at Charles Darwin and his life and how he evolved. Not necessarily his theory, but also as the person, Charles Darwin. This is from the book In What Darwin Really Said, and this is the historian Farrington. He makes mention that Charles Darwin fails to acknowledge previous evolutionary concepts from others. Charles Darwin was not the first one to come to these conclusions and this theory. There were others. There were contemporaries of his that had similar ideas and theories as well. Charles Darwin's own grandfather was considering things before Darwin was even alive. He actually died before Darwin was born. Farrington writes, "No reader, however, could guess from the opening page of The Origin that descent with modification had a long history before Darwin took up his pen." Note, Erasmus Darwin, grandfather to Charles, proposed two questions. Listen carefully. Did all living creatures, including man, descend from a single common ancestor? And if so, how could species be transformed from one to another? These same questions were proposed long before Darwin. As Darwin was even a child, there were men in England proposing and considering these things. Darwin, of course, has become infamous and famous for his theory. More famous than anyone else that proposed very similar concepts and ideas. Here's a note from Gertrude Himmelfarb, a German biographer, who mentions Darwin relegated his grandfather Erasmus to a footnote in his historical sketch as having anticipated the views and erroneous grounds of opinion of Lamarck. Luther Sunderland, another author who wrote the book Darwin's Enigma, he writes, "It does seem rather inexplicable that Darwin failed to give his grandfather any recognition for his contribution to the theory of evolution, which he presented in The Origin as though it were an original idea. It was not. It was not." So, and Darwin very well knew that. Charles Darwin very well knew that it was not an original idea. And he never met his grandfather, but I'm sure he read what his grandfather had written. And it probably built and weighed in his heart and evolved within him with his own theories as they were evolving with his experiences in his HMS Beagle voyage and where they took him to the Galapagos Islands. Now, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, 1744-1829, he was also an evolutionist, and he brought criticism on the evolutionary theory, however, with his ideas about giraffes stretching their necks for higher vegetation because a drought dried up the lower leaves. In 1813, now Darwin is 4 years old in 1813. Listen carefully though. 3 men independently presented rebuttals to Lamarckism at the Royal Society in London. And they all supported the concept of natural selection, like Charles Darwin did many years after them. Darwin still occasionally yielded to Lamarckism when writing his 1859 book. Interesting. Resorting to it to explain the origin of the giraffe's long neck. There's a book called Science vs. Evolution. I want to mention what it asserts. In his book, Darwin reasoned from theory to facts and provided little evidence for what he had to say. Modern evolutionists are ashamed of the book with its ridiculous arguments. And I must say, out of fairness, I've had professors that were staunch Darwinian evolutionists. I had another professor that said, no, Darwin was totally wrong, I'm right. Here's how it happened. He had his own theory. Very, very interesting. So, as things have evolved over time, some still hold to Darwinian evolution, and some do not. And they're all educated people. But if you find holes in a theory, a concept or idea, you begin to consider other alternatives. I want to share more with you, and there's much more to share. At this time, I will sign out. Look for another segment with the Creation Darwinian Evolution presentation with George A. James. Thank you for joining me. I hope to see you soon. And always remember, whatever you believe, for whatever reason or reasons you believe it, it is healthy to challenge oneself, whether it be a spiritual challenge, a physical challenge, a challenge regarding one's education and experiences as well. It's a healthy thing to put what we believe to the test. Take care. George A. James. Thanks for joining me. Look for me again soon on YouTube and Facebook. I'm glad you're with me. I'll see you again soon. Take care.